The final session of the day will be about coaching athletes with special needs. Our two panelists are Annette Lynch and Dan Regan. Dr. Lynch is the Senior Manager of Coaching Excellence and Sport Education with the Special Olympics of North America. Mr. Regan is an athlete in seated volleyball and is a strong Paralympic hopeful for next year's Rio Games. He coaches people with disabilities and also brings an athlete's perspective to the discussion. And Syer will moderate this panel. Ms. Syer is the Chief Impact Officer for the Positive Coaching Alliance, a national coaching education organization.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank Wayne and Patrick and Anita for having us. I'm not going to thank Wayne for making us follow that last act. That's a tough act to follow, but we're gonna close strong here and be a strong lead into our lunch. I want to say I'm really humbled to be on stage with you two. It's not every day that you get to sit on stage with two people who have represented the United States. Dan was actually the 2011 Seated Volleyball Player of the Year for the U.S., and that was only 2 years after he started playing. So pretty incredible. Yeah. And then I saw that Annette and I shared in common that we both played field hockey in college, and I thought, well, that's great. And then I saw she played 4 other sports in college as well, before going on to represent the U.S. on our women's basketball team. And now Annette has gone on to coach coaches in Special Olympics at the state level, now for North America and Special Olympics International. So she's really worked with coaches and set best practices for coaches across the world. So it's really an honor to be here with you two today. I wanted to give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the coaching you do and the coaching of coaches. So Dan, why don't we start with you?
Okay. As far as the coaching I do, I guess to introduce myself, I'm Dan Regan. She said I play on the sitting volleyball team, the men's national team. I've actually been playing since 2007, so it's not as impressive as you think. Just been playing with the national team since 2009. When I started in 2007, I actually wasn't very good, but it was just being introduced to the sport. I was injured in 2005, so after that and going through recovery in the hospital and all that, I was introduced to several sports, and I tried just about everything. I tried, swimming and cycling and skiing and just about anything that could find my interest. But I found a lot of those to be work, especially the swimming and cycling. I ended up doing that just to keep in shape until somebody introduced me to the sport of sitting volleyball. So I was introduced probably in 2006 and then started playing in 2007, and took quite a while to actually get good enough to make the team. So.
2 whole years.
2 whole years.
Okay. Yeah.
The kind of coaching that I do. So I primarily work coaching in the sport of sitting volleyball, which isn't, as you find with a lot of sports for people with disabilities, isn't as well known as standing volleyball. I would think everybody in this room has seen standing volleyball. Maybe not everybody in this room has seen sitting volleyball. So I like to focus and work with kids. So oftentimes I'll travel across the country when I'm asked to come and help people coach or at least introduce the sport to children or oftentimes veterans who have recently received a disability, and introduce the sport to them and kind of demonstrate and talk to them about not only sitting volleyball but other sports or avenues they have to help them with newfound injuries, for example. Also work with kids with who are able-bodied, kind of at the club level and high school level for standing volleyball. But my passion is more working with kids with disabilities, because it kind of hits home for me. There's thousands of coaches out there that teach standing volleyball, but there's not many people who have embraced coaching sitting volleyball.
Great, thank you. And Annette, do you want to tell us a little bit about your coaching of coaches?
I got involved in '89 after a career of teaching and coaching in the mainstream. And I've taught and coached at every level, from junior high to high school, Division II to Division I. And then honestly, I think God wasn't going to let me make another mistake, and Special Olympics actually found me. I started out as the director of basketball worldwide, and it was an opportunity to be able to get into the sport and a niche that I found. I started, in developing the sport, but over the course of 11 years at the international level, I worked my way up to director of coaches education worldwide, where it took 5 years, from '95 to 2000. Now, for those of you who are a little older, you'll recognize that the means of communication at that time was not a whole lot like it is nowadays. I mean, the fax machine was just introduced. So we were communicating once at World Games. We put together a team of people who were sport qualified and Special Olympics experienced to be able to create this global system. So it was a good thing, I think, it took 5 years, because we really were looking at coaching education in terms of standards and competencies. In the world at that time, New Zealand, Ireland, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, they all were within their sport federation. They didn't need agendas. They were already firmly entrenched with what they were able to provide their coaches, not just mainstream coaches, but coaches who are working with individuals with disability. But on the other hand, we had third world countries, including the United States, who was not firmly entrenched within the sport federations or with their national governing bodies. And so we needed to have agendas that were based on the standards and competencies so that they could implement the program. So I ended up being the one that put things in one voice, had an opportunity to work with those outstanding people from all over the world, and that's how the coach education system was developed. And then I ended up training trainers who trained coaches, who trained athletes. And so that's how we were able to develop that system.
And Annette, I want to talk in a little while about the resources you've developed. Some of them are sports specific that are now available online for people for free, which is wonderful. You and I met back in 2000 when Positive Coaching Alliance was just getting off the ground at Stanford University. And in 2003, you invited PCA to come speak to your World's Game, the coaches from the U.S. that were going to the World Games in Dublin. And in advance of that, I think we probably had 300 people at that training session. And I said to you, usually when I present, I'm talking to coaches, at the high school level or the youth sports level who are coaching mainstream. What do I need to know? What's different about Special Olympics? And I think I'm willing to admit I was ignorant, and I may have had preconceived notions this is going to be so different from the typical coaches workshop that I give. And I just wanted both of you guys to talk about how different do you think it is to coach athletes with a physical disability or with intellectual disabilities? And I think there is some fear from people who've coached mainstream sports. Can I really do this? And can you address that? And maybe Dan, you could start.
Okay. I think you hit it when you said that one of the limitations is the fear from coaches who are familiar with coaching the traditional sport, I'll call it, rather than the able-bodied sport. They're familiar with that. They've grown up, maybe they played that all their life, and now they're coaching. So they're very comfortable with that, and they're sitting within their comfort zone. And then you introduce a sport that may be similar. In my instance, standing volleyball and sitting volleyball have a lot of similarities and very few things that make it different. But when you introduce that, there's a fear amongst the coaches and that maybe they're not qualified to coach that particular sport. So I think if you can overcome that fear, the comfort zone, I guess, for coaches, I think that'll help.
So when you have volleyball coaches who come to you and ask, what would it be like for me to coach sitting volleyball? How do you tell them about the sport and get them interested in coaching?
Well, luckily, since we are under the umbrella of USA Volleyball, they've kind of embraced our sport, and they have coaching clinics that they have every year, and part of their coaching clinics, even for the standing game, is they introduce the sitting game as well. So they're getting the word out there and the comfort level. So people who are serious about coaching and coaching at higher levels are getting informed about the sport. So in the short time that I've been involved, and I say short time, since 2007, I have seen the sport transformed from nobody knowing anything about it to quite a few people, contacting us and saying, hey, how can I learn more about the game?
Great, thank you. And Annette, I don't know if you remember this conversation that we had all those years ago and what you told me, but can you address this as well?
Yeah, the first thing I said to Tina was, let's just break this down here. There's really more similarities than differences. And one of the things I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to sell you on is it takes years to learn a sport. People who know the sport, it would take me an hour or two to teach you how to work with individuals with intellectual disability. And as Dan mentioned, it really is more out of fear. And we've been able to develop the tools to help coaches work effectively with athletes. Just think about it. You saw Dustin, and Dustin has been over years what he's been able to develop, but always the belief was with proper instruction and encouragement, anybody can learn, and we need to be able to provide the necessary tools in order to do so. And we have that. And right now, it's what we don't have is more people who know the sport. And we're trying to recruit more sport qualified people. So even at the worst, it would be individuals who may know the population and individuals who may know the sport, and together they make a great team. But some of the materials, here's one of them. It's just a 2-page with 8 panels. And it's a quick coaching reference guide, which you can fold one more time and slip in your pocket. And basically, it's behavior characteristics and strategies to improve learning. There's over 256 causes of intellectual disability. Now, there might be more now because the diagnoses are probably a little bit better. But if you take a look at these, learning occurs at a slower rate, short attention span, resistant to change, failure to form social bonds. I guarantee that under duress, all of us evidence a little bit of intellectual disability. So we've taken out the labels. Let's just deal with the behavior. And it goes through the top 5 or 6 strategies so that in practice, if you're, you're working with your team, your staff, and Jay is having a tough time here, focusing. What can we do? We pull out our little quick reference guide and let's try this. And so in essence, what we want to be able to do is these materials are on the website. People don't have time to figure it out. People don't have time to get it written down. And so what we are in the next phase of is helping with the implementation. So we go back to the beginning here is it's really out of fear of the unknown, not that we can't do it.
Wonderful. And can you guys talk a little bit, when I go around and I talk to youth coaches, they say, well, we love this. And the biggest challenge we have is the parents. And the parents are not necessarily positive or honoring the game. What sort of opportunities and challenges do you guys feel like you have with parents in your sports and when their kids are starting to get involved with sports for the first time, and including parents as a positive partner in this?
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I can say that, when you're working with children, I speak more specifically with physical disabilities because that's what I work with more. When you're working with kids with disabilities, oftentimes you're going to need more support sometimes from the parents than you would than someone who's working with a normal child or someone without a disability. There are certain sports that actually require, extra work. You've got equipment to deal with. You've got to load and unload it. Sometimes you'll have a runner, for example, that needs a guide, so maybe the parent could support them as a guide or something like that. But I think the biggest thing is making sure that similar to when we talked about coaches themselves and not being the limiting factor. One of the biggest things is not letting the parent limit what the child can and can't do. I think sometimes they pamper that child a little bit more than they need to, and that may be the case with any child, but oftentimes you'll find that you'll hear the parent saying this child can't do that when the child can and the child wants to, and you might want to let the child, especially if they're up in age a little bit, and let them tell you what they can and can't do.
Thank you, Dan. That's great. Annette?
Yeah, with regard to parents, whatever is happening in the mainstream sooner or later is going to happen in each of our sports. Of course, we haven't exactly heard playing time, but we have heard, my son or daughter, I think that they can do this, or I don't think that they can do this, or they get hot and bothered in competition. And so we have codes of conduct, right down the line, expectations, and the clearer we are, the more positive results that we get. And just as Dan and both Tina have mentioned, we don't want to be the limiting factors. I mean, there's already limitations there because of how other people treat them. The other aspect of this is, which is, I mean, it blew me away when I heard this statistic. In terms of obesity, our population is well over 40%. And in Special Olympics, it's higher because they really only train most often once a week. We're trying to ensure that they bump up that training and they have more frequent competition. But at the home is to be able to help with nutrition, with fitness. And actually what we're going through right now is looking at a little flip. If we do a better job with fitness and nutrition, they can participate in any sport. Because some of the sports, frankly, are not as rigorous. Bocce and bowling, while they're age appropriate, you know, there's not a whole lot of activity there. And so what we're looking at being able to do is looking at alternative training formats and helping to get the word to the parents and involving what I did my last year when I coached the Special Olympics athletes for 9 years, and actually they were the only players that I ever had that told me I was a good coach. So, but what we ended up doing, the very first practice of the season, everybody came together and it was a social event. But what we did at that event was we went through a home training program. And it involved a variety of flexibility kinds of things, walking program, so that the family, and we did it right there. And of course everybody comes for food, and then we finished with food at the end. But we had the program for them, and we noticed a decided difference, not just in the athletes, but guess what? Where else did we notice an improvement? In the parents and the siblings. And for the first time, they started doing things together. Not that they couldn't have done it before, but part of it may have been they just hadn't considered it. So with regard to parents, we also were sympathetic. With our population, with age, doesn't necessarily things go away. Parents are bothered, like, what will occur when I'm no longer here? Who's going to help take care of or support my son or daughter if I don't have siblings? So during this time, we want to be mindful of, if a parent needs a break, take the break during practice, because that may be the only break that they have during the week. But we also want to be able to provide support to them to be able to help with regard to the fitness, conditioning, nutrition, and so on, so that we have a positive situation at home, just as we're trying to create one, you know, at practice.
Thanks, Annette. I love the fact that the strategies that you're using, they're the same ones I'm using with my son's U8 soccer team. I have the privilege of being the head coach for the 3rd year in a row. And this year we kicked off our season, and I asked all the parents to come to the first practice ready to play. So I had all these moms, dads, guardians there with their, soccer shoes ready to play, with their running shoes, some in jeans. But we actually had like a parents versus athletes scrimmage, and got out there, and they all got to feel how hard it was, right, to actually play the sport. It's hard to trap a soccer ball. And then I've heard throughout the season that they're now playing at home with their kids, where previously they hadn't done that. And I think the idea that you can teach that in this setting and then parents can take that home is really powerful. I want to talk specifically about the resources. So we have a lot of leaders in the room who are helping train up coaches who need sport-specific coaching guides. They need to know where to go to find out the rules for different sports. Can we point them in the right direction of what's out there? So resources specifically for trainers of coaches and coaches themselves. Dan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first, and I'll let her do it better. there are a lot of resources online, obviously. Some of them are very good that you can find. But I've found that when working with different sports, that one of the best resources, surprisingly, was local parks and recs departments. Some of them are better than others, but contacting them and telling them what you want to do, or asking them what opportunities are out there for a child with whatever disability they might have. They were very helpful in a few of the cities that I've seen. In fact, when I was in San Antonio going through my therapy, even as an adult, the San Antonio Parks and Rec was very, very helpful in actually providing both the staff and equipment for us to try different sports and see if it's something that we might like, and then maybe pursue after that. So I know that was one good resource. For us, once again, I got to go back to USA Volleyball. If we're specifically talking about volleyball, you'll have the links to how to play the sitting game, and resources. They'll kind of guide you towards our sitting volleyball coordinator, who you can talk to further and say, hey, I want to learn more about the sport.
Great, thanks.
We have a website. Actually, it's been divided, so it's a little bit easier to navigate. resources.specialolympics.org. And you can get on that resources page. You can go to sports, and within that sports category, I think we have 31 sports. And with each one of those sports, there's a coaching guide, there's a quick start guide, which is a little bit shorter. There are the rules of that sport. And within the coaching guide, there are videos so that you can access how this looks. The Brave New World, we're looking at being able to put certain things on an app so that you can video the athlete and they can see the athlete. I mean, now those apps are already present. You can show the athlete what this should look like, because our athletes learn a lot by imitation and by sight because they have word processing problems. So with that said, these materials are there. I know I gave Wayne, and I'm not sure quite where they are, in the back of the room. There's a pager where there are some direct links that you don't have to navigate the system, and you can go. And this is one of them. But there are all the other pieces, important websites, important areas where you can access that information are now readily available.
I want to ask you guys one more question and then open it up to the audience, so get ready with your questions. One of the things at Positive Coaching Alliance we talk about is the power of sport to teach larger life lessons, and I think this just goes across all sports. And I had the opportunity to talk to Carol Dweck, who is a professor at Stanford in psychology. She wrote the book Mindset. And one of the things she said is that coaches and teachers and parents have a really important responsibility to help kids see the lessons they're learning in sports, how those are transferable to the classroom, to a social setting, to a job. And she said if an adult doesn't make that connection for them, kids will not transfer naturally a lesson they're learning in sports to those other environments. So I'm curious, maybe it's a story that you have or specific things you do to help your coaches make that connection for athletes, the things they're learning in your venues and your settings. Because kids they may not continue to play sports forever. We're focused on youth here today, but the lessons they learn through sports can help them forever. So maybe you had a coach who is particularly good at this. Maybe there's something you do to help athletes take a lesson and use it in another venue. And after you guys both have a crack at that one, we'll open it up for the audience. I'm going to let Annette take this one first. Dan, yeah, go ahead, Annette.
That's an interesting point, because right now we're going through, and as our coaches are coaching, concepts are the most difficult. We need to make concepts concrete. And so actually, of all the sports, soccer has probably started out and done it the best, using the games approach to teach skills. So in essence, what you're doing, you're utilizing low organized games, but you're still working on skills, because our athletes can't automatically make the connection. And this is what I'm referring to. If I'm working on shooting and I go to play the game, how do I figure out where shooting goes in the game unless I've seen it? So if I'm doing a type of, and so the coaches are maybe doing stations, and the other pet peeve is where we've got maybe 3 or 4 coaches, and one of the coaches, probably the head coach, is working with one athlete, and we got 15 other athletes over here watching them, as opposed to 15 other athletes having been divided up, giving our assistant coaches a position, having them fulfill a role. So now we got all 15 people moving. Now we have a better shot at more touches to the ball, learning the skills, knowing how to put it in a game, and then actually doing it. So we've got, what we have is a practice plan so that with the warm-up, they're just not doing activities for the sake of activities. They are really kind of warming up their skills along the way. And you move right into a low organized activity. So if they're dribbling, maybe they're dribbling against another individual in a smaller space, so that now they're doing offense and defense, even though they don't know they're doing offense and defense. And then we move into shooting the ball. So they're dribbling, they're protecting it, and then they go in and shoot. So what in essence is occurring, they're moving through this, and we're helping them make the connection between the skill and the game, and then we play. So this progression, one, allows coaches a role to play, and they're playing it. Secondly, it allows the athletes knowing what this transition is without them directly having to put things together and saying, this is going to follow, this is going to follow that.
Annette, you're getting me fired up. I'm wanting to play, listening to you talk about your energy is coming out. So Dan, the life lessons and how we help kids transfer those from sports to other parts of their lives.
Well, my answer is a little more vague than hers, but the first thing that came to mind is just sports can translate to just about anything in life. It's a matter of, you learn early, I guess, when you're playing sports, that the amount of work that you put in is going to, typically, depending on someone's natural ability, it's going to directly relate to how much reward there is. So if you're just there to have fun, and that's okay. If you're playing sports, a lot of kids, you want to introduce them to sports because they have a lot of fun with it. That's fine. But for the kids that I think someone mentioned earlier, they want to get to that next step. They've been playing for a while, and then they decide, wait, that kid didn't play by the rule, or they messed up. We need to be real strict with this, and they want to get to that next level and be more competitive. I think they really learn that by the amount of work that you put into something can really pay off. So when you get to your job or you're in college and you're studying, and you think about, well, how hard do I really have to study? Do I need to study enough to get the grade, or do I need to study enough to actually learn it so that I can go out and get a good job and be productive in life, So I think that, in that regard, sports can really translate to how hard you work to achieve the goals that you want to achieve.
Thank you, Dan. Annette, you want to add something?
Yeah, just because our athletes happen to have an intellectual disability, and some of them may be recreational athletes, and others may have an aspiration to be the best. Every single athlete deserves the best in coaching. And every single coach needs to be the best in training. And so we're looking at education as being ongoing, not once and done. And for some of our volunteers, that's a little bit difficult because they think they know. They don't know. They need to know more.
Thank you, Annette. So questions in the audience about coaching or coaching of coaches, please go ahead.
The entire day has been focused on mobility issues and intellectual issues. Have you had any exposure to deafness or deaf and hard of hearing issues within your own discipline? And it would be called Deaf Plus with an athlete that is intellectually challenged and deaf, or Deaf Plus with a mobility issue and deafness. What are the challenges that you had, and what revelations might you have had as well?
Well, I can speak quickly on that because I have not really had experience working with someone with a deafness, so I can't really relate to that.
Having started out in Washington, D.C., Gallaudet University is there. And so I had the good fortune of being able to work with them. And actually, I had an opportunity to be a guest coach. And you really learn when you're coaching those athletes what to do and what not to do, and that they are facing you or that you're stomping the floor to be able to get their attention. And actually, I found deaf athletes to be a whole lot more responsive because it was like they were street fighters. Street fighters, I term an individual who, regardless of what they can do, they can figure it out because oftentimes they haven't always had that support. So they have had to find ways in order to succeed. And what I found out in coaching deaf athletes is they were a whole lot more sensitive to what was going on in front of them. Now, of course, I coach basketball. I didn't coach these athletes any other sport, but I found them to, one, be responsive, and two, I knew what they were feeling, and quite easily because of how they were responding to me. If they didn't like what was going on, I knew immediately that they did not know what they liked going on. But I found that it was more difficult as they worked together. I needed to pair them up where somebody who was a little higher ability was working with someone with a little lower ability so that there was a regression, but the person who had more ability ended up becoming much more sensitive to the other individual, and it helped us with team cohesion. So that's
You may no longer have the mic, but do you have any additional thoughts on this that you could share with the group?
right because of
I do. I run the only program of its kind. I'm a tennis pro, and we teach life's lessons to deaf. I'm a tennis pro, and we teach life's lessons to deaf and hard of hearing kids through tennis. There's a lot of life's lessons there that can be had. And the benefit with our program is that it's not only while they're a kid, but it carries on well into adulthood, where they can play with an able-bodied athlete and or a seated athlete as well on a tennis court now. It's called up and down tennis, but tennis is a cool sport where language doesn't matter. The thing is, though, is that they are so isolated, and 1% graduates from college. They're never going to have money to afford lessons.
Thank you for the work you're doing.
yeah, absolutely.
Do we have another question? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Kerry Hastings with the Play Like a Champion Today program with the University of Notre Dame. And I have helped coordinate some research in the past couple of years. We've been trying to focus on developing some primarily online resources for working with athletes who have special needs, mostly geared towards the coaches, but also parents. And as talked about in the first panel, we've seen such a shortage in facilities and equipment and finances. But what we've also noticed is that there's such a shortage of coaches, and just being able to obtain qualified or qualified enough coaches. And often it's a parent, and we see in smaller communities especially, it's very difficult to just recruit people to coach, and the athletes are there, and there's a lot of, even if there are willing administrators or organizers. So how do people, especially in these smaller communities, go about recruiting coaches now that we have more resources coming out? And is there any formal outreach in place that you know of in terms of actually obtaining coaches?
Want to jump in there?
The resources for each sport would be different, so I don't know how I could answer that. But one of the things that jumped out when you were asking your question, and this was referenced earlier, one of the other panels, the connection between the need and an ambassador, for example. If you're looking for somebody with knowledge in a specific sport, for example, who better than to go to somebody who's actually done that before? And that may not just be for coaching that individual, it may be for coaching the coach. So when you find an ambassador that can help and bring them in, maybe even if it's one time or once a year, just to help coach the coach, then the coach has the more familiarity, and they'll be able to assist them at a local level.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think the other part is too, we're going through a period right now with, I have a committee with each one of the areas that I'm working with the coaches. It's called our Coach Development Resource Team. And one of the areas we're working on right now is recruitment. And with the recruitment, who do we go after? How do we go after them? And one of the methods is who in the coaching community has just retired. Maybe it's an athletic director. Maybe it's a particular coach. But it's always going to be someone that has the respect of the community. So for me, when I was in the D.C. area, Morgan Wooten retired. Well, he's a very famous high school coach. I guarantee, and Morgan said, I'd be happy to help you. Now, Morgan has players all over the place. Now, you think if Morgan Wooten said, hey, come on, Jerry, they need some help over here. Who's going to say no to Morgan? So being able to find who that key individual is in the community, who has the respect, who obviously after years of being successful. Another individual we would go after would be a junior high coach. What are they used to doing? They're used to developing players. And I guarantee most of the time it's because people haven't been asked. And it's almost like, I'm afraid to ask because I'm afraid to be turned down. And so they're making a decision based on something that may not even be true. And that individual may not be able to do it themselves, but in the sport community, people know people. So being able to get those referrals, and so those are two really viable ways that we found success that, I would suggest, to the group.
Great. You don't get if you don't ask.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have some other questions? Alan, you're going to be a Positive Coaching Alliance plant in the audience. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alan Burkus. I'm with Positive Coaching Alliance. Tina's my boss, so this better be a good question. But I was lucky enough to be introduced to Annette and spend some time with her at the Special Olympics. And we watched a lot of games, and they were unified teams. Can you talk about the difference of coaching a unified team from a coach's point of view? Or is that a good way to get into coaching special needs kids because you've got some able bodies on the court?
And maybe tell everybody what unified means.
Unified Sports is a program that actually was developed back in the 80s. Bo Doherty was the program director and training director in Massachusetts at that time. He had some older athletes who wanted to play softball, but they didn't have enough to play softball. So he contacted the B League and said, look, I've got some guys that would like to play. Would you mind if we just divvied them up amongst your team and we could play? And the guy said, sure, that's okay. And so this is the power of unified sports. So after the first practice, one of the athletes came up to Bo and jumped on him, gave him a big bear hug. And Bo said, okay, what's happening? And he said, after the game was over, they went to a local pub, had a drink, just like all the players do, and then went home. And this athlete said, I finally feel like a real person. What unified sports does is people come together with and without intellectual disability and they play on the same team. So the coach's job is to not let them feel different. The coach's job is to, right from the very beginning, help with team cohesion. And what you do, as any good coach would do, is athletes and partners begin working together from the very beginning. And because our athletes may take a little bit longer and they may not be used to relationships, especially if they may border on autism, being able to work with someone they may want to work with And 2, work with them a little bit longer, like a few weeks before you start changing up things. They get to know other people on the team. They get to kind of ease into it, but the coach is looking at, from the very beginning, athletes and partners working together. And we found out, actually, for those of you who are looking at raising funds, that these young professionals from 25 to 35 years of age who were partners, this age group is very purposeful in what they want to give back. They're the ones that are going to help to save, this generation. And what they are doing is they found that the benefit that they got out of unified sports, they want to pay it forward. And they're young professionals now. And in Washington, D.C. a year ago, of the money that was raised, almost 40% came from these 25 to 35 years of age. They also are the first to hire our athletes because they found them to be dependable, reliable. They oftentimes don't put them in positions where speed may necessarily be a factor, but our athletes are accurate. They love being able to work. They know what it looks like, and they're going to try to keep that job. They don't miss work. They don't want to take a vacation because they're afraid that the job's not going to be there when they get back. So that's been the benefit of unified sports in the programming.
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Do we have any more questions? Yes, here in the front. Brian.
So we just finished running the equestrian competition at the World Games. So we had the opportunity to see 123 athletes from 36 countries. We also had the opportunity to see and kind of have a good look at the coaching styles, skill sets, and philosophies from 36 different corners of the globe. The range, in my view, is way too wide. That scale from high to low really needs to be narrowed to ensure the integrity of the competition, because then there's this enormous drive within the dynamics of the competition to really lower the caliber of the competition to the lowest common denominator. So working on those skill sets across the globe, which of course is an enormous task, is one area that I would certainly like to see. I think in our particular area, in equestrian, when you say the biggest problem is fear, I would say the biggest problem in our sport is the problem of good intentions and not having. In our sport, you have consequences. If things get matched badly or set up incorrectly, you have real dramatic damage in a big way that has an impact then on the ability of us to mount the sport. So you'll see that, for example, right now in Southern California and Northern California, one of the most populous states in the nation, we don't have a Special Olympics equestrian program. A lot of reasons for that. But from my experience in watching how Special Olympics has been implemented over the last 20 or 30 years, is that there hasn't been an appreciation enough for exactly how it needs to be put together. And some of that is coaching, some of that's judging and officiating, and some of it's management as well.
You bring up an excellent point. There are some sports that are high-risk sports, and not just anybody can be involved. That's one issue. The second issue is you know what you can do, but you don't know what somebody else can do. And so what we're trying to put in place is a good educational system, but it's only as good as the people who get the proper clinicians with the proper training, that we can give not only the coaches the proper education, but also the athletes. So it's a big issue. And it's an issue that we're trying to tackle both globally, but it's almost like we've been more successful starting at the local level, working with those individuals as we've moved up the line. I don't know, honestly, if I'm going to see it in my lifetime, Brian. I hope I see that what coaches are getting is the best training. We're recruiting more equestrian people so that because of the background that they have, looking at our mission and philosophy, that coach has to have our mission and philosophy at heart, which means winning is achieving, attaining a personal best, not walking over somebody's face. All of it comes into play. And there are some sports that have been more difficult than others. But for the first, I saw in this games, I saw more trained athletes than I've seen before. But I've also seen and been disappointed. There were people at our games that should have not been at our games because they weren't trained. And because we wanted 170 countries there, for my mind, it wasn't probably the best decision. But being able to provide opportunity to people to get here, you know, it was a tremendous experience for them. But once you get to a World Games, the expectation is that those athletes are trained and they've had frequent competition, so they're prepared for the event. So we're in process.
Annette, thank you. I want to wish Dan all the best in Rio, and I hope you guys will be watching him as he competes. Yeah. And I don't know that many current athletes who are striving for the Olympics who are also taking time to coach. So I appreciate him so much for coaching and for being a role model. That's what got him involved, was seeing the captain and the U.S. Olympic coach, and that's why he got involved, and now he's doing that. And Annette, I want to thank you just for a lifetime of service. And I think it's not just the work you've personally done, but the training of other coaches and the ripple effect of what you've done. And finally, I want to thank all of you who are here today, because I think one thing we share in common is the idea that sports are so powerful and that all kids deserve access. Positive Coaching Alliance exists because we have record dropout rates in this country. We have declining participation in youth sports in this country. And it's sickening to know that fewer kids are participating, not more. But I think that for kids with disabilities, we're seeing opportunities growing, and that's because of you guys and other people in this room. And I think we can all be part of moving us in the right direction. So thank you, LA84, for this forum. It means so much to see this room packed, and I know that it was full weeks ago. So thank you guys, and thanks everybody in the room.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette and Dan and Tina, for sharing the experience. One thing I want to mention is all of the panelists and participants, if you could come up at the end of this, we're going to do a group photo. Next, we're going to head to lunch, but first, we should thank the LA84 Foundation for doing this, bringing us together to have this discussion. And a report on today's summit will be available on the website. Contact Wayne if you have any questions. Also, a YouTube video of the production will be available at a later date. We will all notify you of these updates as they happen. This concludes this summit, and we want to thank you all for attending and being here. Please join us next door for lunch. That concludes. Thank you.